we are going to be talking about poems of Black Africa. First of all, we have to take a look at the evolution of African poetry, which has its root in oral tradition. African tradition is very much concerned with bringing out the communal thought and philosophy of a people. It should be considered that Africans had lived a well-defined societal life with very strong governments and rules, and there were very strict moral codes, and those who found themselves wanting in one reason or the other were reprimanded for the crimes that they had committed. Information in African literature was handed down from one generation to another. These pieces of information had literary aspects which were handed down through myths, songs, incantations, folk tales, and legends. Though the mode of transmission was purely oral, they also had literary function of teaching and entertainment. Through these various elements, they enforced African values to future generations, such as respect for the old, moral decency, bravery, communality, respect for ancestral spirits, and the continuous maintenance of a cordial relationship between the living and the dead. The only way to maintain such a delicate relationship is through rituals, sacrifices, incantation, praise songs, and festivities. Once the ancestral spirits are appeased, it is but clear that there will be general happiness and prosperity for the living. In the case that this relationship was broken, the living could find themselves experiencing disaster, and poverty in the community. It is therefore to note that African continent was also, invaded by Christianity. And they referred to the Africans generally as being uncivilized. Their conquest and domination of African peoples only came with strong resistance, and the fact that Africans used crude weapons such as spears and cutlasses. Though the people were conquered, the conqueror knew that they had met brave people who were greatly attached to their traditions and culture. The second phase of African literature is that of man's domination. For example, the white man had achieved this through the implantation of Christianity, which of course was the white man's culture, which, came to erode the traditional beliefs of the people. After the first contact with the white man and their conqueror, the second phase was that of colonial administration and domination. The colonial administration was characterized by exploitation, discrimination, man's inhumanity to man, brutality, and violence. They exploited African rich soil, and they also subjected its people to slave labor to develop their colonies for their own prestige, and many people lost their lives in the process. The pioneer Black intellectuals came to realize that they were merely ridiculed by their education. They could be either accepted as white or real Africans, thereby becoming neutral persons. It dawned therefore on them that despite their education, their European masters looked down on them. This realization opened their eyes to clearly see that the African ways of life and their perception is very different from that of European values. Apart from these behavioral prejudices, we can therefore understand that they came to realize the inhumane injuries that Africans have been subjected to, such as slave trade and other slave practices. Thereby, educated Africans or blacks like Aimé Césaire and Leopold Sédar Senghor and their contemporaries developed a new way of thinking which was purely protest and rebellious. This became the philosophy which was known as negritude. The foundation of this philosophy was based on adoration and glorification of everything black. This type of thinking had given rise to a popular feeling of the time known as Africanism, championed by Nasser, Lumumba, Sekou Touré, and others. This feeling and movement marked the beginning of another phase of African history. The Pan-Africanists, contributed to the wave of rebellion across the continent with a demand for immediate independence from European powers. Many freedom movements sprang in many countries in the West, East, and even those in the South that were fighting against apartheid in the 1980s. In this system, all the laws of the apartheid were only in favor of the white man. Independence did not come on a platter of gold as many fighters lost their lives. There were many atrocities committed against the freedom fighters, but at the end, independence was achieved in many countries. And the last phase of African development in literature is that which dealt with post-colonialism. These new leaders had inherited new nations that were heavily dependent on their former colonial masters economically, politically, and militarily. This gave a new wave of recolonization, with the white man exploiting the resources of Africa, and the new African leaders were mere handboys or stooges who were accomplices with their foreign thieves to invade the continent. Their job was to make sure that they stabilized their countries with preachings of peace and unity, and any leader who did not take orders from the master met the fatal end to be overthrown by a military takeover. We can therefore understand that during this period is what we could call new colonialism. To understand, African poetry, we must be able to classify them according to their themes so that we can better understand which of the poems can be used for which thematic